Anyone else talking about it on the way in? No, just my.
And Josh, we don't have Nancy up on the screen. Sir.
Hurdle that cord.
Well, I'll do my announcements while he's getting ready to go, so we're out of time. But I'm Janet Boat, I'm your ambassador today, and I want to welcome you. I'm excited about this. So, I think you're all the same.
Still wish.
I think you've all signed in, appreciate that. Please silence your cell phones. Sometimes we forget to, we think we've done it, and then we haven't, but please do that. You will be getting an evaluation in your email following the course. We do really appreciate getting those back, so please do that. Positive or negative suggestions for future classes. We really do want to hear from you. Also check your email often because OLLI does have a lot of news coming out.
Thank you. Sir.
Opportunities, class reminders, that kind of thing. So check that out. And you know, suggest to your family and friends if you know people who would benefit from this program, taking the classes, a little bit of intellectual stimulation, socialization. Please spread the word so that we can grow OLLI. I think that's all for announcements. I want to introduce to you Nancy Markey and Kay Adams. They are lifelong friends who have joined forces to research and write about little-known stories of the Gilded Age. And I know little too, so I'm excited to learn about it. Their long-form narratives have been published by narratively.com and Smithsonian Magazine, as well as local Newport, Rhode Island publications. So we're very happy to have you.
Thank you, Janet. And we'd like to welcome everyone to our presentation, Stories and Secrets of the Gilded Age. The better half of Gilded Age authors is my companion here and lifelong friend, Nancy Markey, and she is coming to us via Zoom from a place synonymous with the Gilded Age, Newport, Rhode Island. So Nancy and I are going to be taking turns today and narrating the presentation. It should take just a little over an hour, so we should have plenty of time at the end for questions and discussions. I see most of y'all have notepads, so write it down so we can talk about it when we're through. That being said, Nancy, take it away.
Hi, everybody. I don't know if you can see me or not. I'm sorry, I'm getting over a cold, so I might cough a little bit my way through here. As Kay said, I'm coming from Newport, and I know that there's time at the end of the presentation for questions, but if there's something that one of us says that makes you have a question immediately, we're happy to take those questions on the spot. So like Kay said, we're lifelong friends. I'm actually from Fayetteville. We've known each other since we were 10 years old, and we started researching the Gilded Age, primarily just exclusively the Gilded Age. And what Kay and I enjoy telling people about the Gilded Age is about the people that lived in the Gilded Age. And so hopefully today we're going to weave in stories of various people that we find interesting that lived in the Gilded Age, while also giving you more of the drier facts about the Gilded Age. So we're going to try to keep it as interesting as possible. Now, looking ahead, this is the introduction and the overview, and we are going to be talking about some of the robber barons, but just nutshell discussions about them. But on October 20th, we're going to be presenting a deeper dive, a more in-depth look at a lot of the robber barons, primarily the Vanderbilts. You could do 6 series on the Vanderbilts alone. They're amazing. And some other, we're going to throw in some other robber barons also. And then on November 14th, we're doing a presentation about the domestics and the working classes that worked for the robber baron and the uber rich. And because I'm in Newport, we have over 20 of the existing Gilded Age mansions that are still here. So there's 4 or 5 that are Vanderbilt alone, but some of the other robber barons we're going to be talking about today, some of them had, again, it's summer homes here in Newport. They didn't live here year round. And so we're excited to share our research with you and our stories. We hope we see you in October and November. So we're going to start with just the very basic question: what was the Gilded Age? And so this is the nutshell definition. It's an era of rapid economic growth and industrialization, characterized by political corruption and vast social inequality. So a lot of those phrases sound very familiar to us today. And I always tell Kay, I wouldn't be surprised if when history books are written about this period, if they don't call it the Gilded Age too. So a lot of the things that we're going to say today might resonate with you as 21st century people.
The next question is obviously, when was the Gilded Age? When was the era? And it's important to note that it's not a hard and fast time frame as some might think, because many historians believe the first few years of the 20th century would also qualify as a Gilded Age period. But technically speaking, most people say it's really kind of what happened in between Reconstruction and the start of the Progressive Era. So we say plus or minus 1870 to roughly 1898.
And then you might ask, why is it called the Gilded Age? And so back to my point before, where the history books might write this era as the second Gilded Age. When the Gilded Age was happening, they didn't call it the Gilded Age. It wasn't named the Gilded Age until actually the 1920s, when they're looking backwards. And they picked up on a term that Mark Twain had coined in the 1890s. And of course, we all know Mark Twain was an author, a satirist, a humorist. And he meant it as a sarcastic term, because looking back on it, looked like this golden age of prosperity and happiness. But it was really, in Twain's view, a gilded age, and it was glittery on the surface, filled with corruption and poverty underneath. So Mark Twain was not shy about sharing his opinion about people. And in fact, some of the robber barons that we're going to talk about today, he had very unkind words to share about them. And there were other literary authors during the Gilded Age that were important too. Now, authors were very important during the Gilded Age because they had a vast audience interested in their writings. And, you know, of course, they didn't have social media. They didn't even have telephones. So it was newspapers and books and magazines where people got the news of the day. And you might recognize the name Henry James. He was another famous author of the era, and he lived in Newport in the 1850s. And then he goes to Europe for many decades, and he comes back to Newport during the Gilded Age, and he's horrified by the change in Newport. There's these mansions all over Bellevue Avenue, and they're all over the Cliff House. How many people have been to Newport? Has anybody been to Newport in the audience? Okay, so you know
Nancy,
what I'm
we have
about.
several, yeah.
Yeah, so you know what I'm talking about when it's hard to, and we're going to show you pictures of these mansions, but until you're standing in front of them or going in them, you really can't appreciate the largeness and the scale of these mansions. And so when Henry James came back to Newport, he called them white elephants. And white elephants means that it's a possession that's useless or bothersome, expensive to maintain, and interestingly, difficult to dispose of. Because he turns out this characterization of these homes turns out to be true, because today in Newport, all of these mansions are either owned by historical societies or colleges or been converted into condominiums. None of these, behemoth mansions of the Gilded Age are private residences today anymore. And then the last one is just Edith Wharton. She wrote during the Gilded Age. She also had a summer home in Newport. Again, these are all summer homes. And her maiden name was Jones. And so if you've ever heard the expression, keeping up with the Joneses, that was Edith Wharton's family. So Edith Wharton came from a very privileged, wealthy family, and she lived in the Gilded Age and knew the players. She knew the Vanderbilts, and she wrote about them without using their names. And she was the first female to be awarded the Pulitzer Prize for her book, Age of Innocence. Now, the book wasn't written until 1920. but it takes place in 1870s. So if you haven't read that book or seen the movie, it gives you a great feeling of the social dilemmas and the conspicuous consumption of the era. And don't feel sorry for Mark Twain. He had his own Gilded Age mansion. If you've been to Hartford, Connecticut, again, this is not in Mark Twain's family. This is in, it's owned by a not-for-profit organization.
So in order to understand the Gilded Age, why it occurred, you really kind of have to wind back to the years before the Gilded Age. And the United States was long a nation of localities and regions. If you needed a good or service, you had to go to a skilled craftsman or provider within the community. And if it wasn't available and you had to get it right away to get something, the only way anything got brought to you was either by stagecoach, streamers, barge, and the stagecoach is being pulled by animals. There were no good means of transportation nationwide.
So, of course, there was wealth before the people of the Gilded Age, but we just want to review kind of what were the sources of wealth. And the old money was considered money that had been handed down through at least 2 generations. And usually that came with some type of pedigree, because to have the pedigree, you wanted to be able to show that your ancestors either were colonists or came over during the Revolution. In New York, it was that you were Dutch. And so this old money, which people did nothing to earn, they just, lived, they inherited it. That was the prestigious money of the time. And the new money, which is the entrepreneurs we're going to talk about, where they earned their money, that was actually looked down upon. And so the old money came a lot through land, real estate. You might have got it from the crown. It was handed down through generations. They planted on it, cotton farmers, tobacco farmers. In fact, one of the richest families during the Gilded Age were the Lollards. I don't know if anybody recognizes that name, but they started out during colonial times with a snuff factory. And then it went to cigars and pipe tobacco, and then it evolved into modern day cigarettes. And they didn't, the Lollard cigarette company was just sold within the last 10 years. But they also came to Newport in the summer before the Vanderbilts and before the more modern Gilded Age people. And they had wooden villas. So they had these large wooden villas that the new Gilded Age people are going to come in and tear down and build these stone and granite and rock homes. And of course, people became rich from war. The Colts, they created weapons, gunpowder. They were profiteers. And that just means that they got unreasonable profits. You might recognize Brooks Brothers clothing. They became rich because they sold clothing to the Union Civil War armies. And the Burdine family, who were wealthy through iron, they started their wealth by selling horseshoes to the Union Army. And so there was a lot of wealth, but it's not the kind of wealth that's going to exist during the Gilded Age.
So if you weren't one of the lucky ones to have inherited and you didn't have the wealth, what was the impetus that started more people being able to get wealth in the United States? And quite frankly, you would look to the gold rush of the late 1840s and 1850s. The gold rush in and of itself, yes, there were miners and prospectors who did get money from the gold rush through those services. But primarily, most of the wealth that developed during the gold rush were the ancillary services that were being provided to those that are going out to do the mining. We had hardware companies providing shovels, picks, tents, etc. And then along with it, you had merchants providing groceries, food, banks, brothels, saloons, the whole kit and caboodle. So as the country went west to find their fortune in mining, the merchants went with them. And interestingly, the only way you could get to the West Coast to mine during that time was by steamer ship, which was the route was interestingly created by Cornelius Vanderbilt. We wanted to include a picture here just to give you an example. During the Gilded Age, 1877, Deadwood, South Dakota, a perfect example of a mining town and what followed the miners. So this is what you would have seen, this vast assortment of different kinds of service providers, merchants, liquor stores, banks. And this is what where money was starting to be made. But it can best be said, the Gilded Age came in on the rails, was ushered in by the growth of the railroads of the United States. Starting in 1827, when the Baltimore, Ohio Railroad was first opened on wooden rails, to the 1850s, when trains were running on iron rails, and expanding to the east with most major water ports on the Mississippi River. So here's a graph that shows you that progression very nicely. On your left, 1830, just very small segments on the Atlantic seaboard. By 1840, 10 years later, again, disjointed segments, but primarily on the Atlantic seaboard. By 1850, look what's happening. Some of these disjointed segments are starting to get connected. And now we're going to the major ports in, for instance, Memphis, Tennessee, St. Louis, Natchez, and New Orleans. So that's where you see the growth. But by the start of the Civil War, we now have a very solid expansion of rail, and it's starting to just creep west of the Mississippi River. The important rail routes were now encompassing the Missouri River as well. But by the end of the 1860s, the most important rail line of all lines in the United States gets completed. Nancy, tell us about it.
So it's the Transcontinental Railroad that Kay's talking about. And believe it or not, it was built in the 1860s. It was completed in 1869. And it was part of this manifest destiny that was sweeping the nation. And the government wanted the continent settled. They wanted people there. They wanted routes there. They wanted to be able to get goods and services from the East Coast to the West Coast. Remember, the miners are in California. California is starting to grow, and there's starting to be a fair amount of people there. But to get there, it's very difficult. And so as early as 1862, which is, right at the beginning of the Civil War, the government started providing financial incentives to build this railroad across the country. Now, in order to get the track to build the railroad across the country, like Kay said earlier, you'd have to take it from the East Coast and go down to Panama on a ship, walk across the land, get on another ship, and ship it to the West Coast so that you would have the track then build eastward. So it was a monumental undertaking. And what was the incentive for people to do that? Well, of course, the government made it a financial incentive. So for each mile of track that was laid, the government would give the company 6,400 acres of land, and then they could sell that land and make some money. And then they also gave them bonds, and they would give, if it was a level land that you were working on, you would get $16,000 worth of bonds. If it was mountainous, then you would get, the amount would increase up to $48,000 per bond. And the bonds were payable at 6%. And they'd issue them every 40 miles of completed track. And so because the railroads had already started in the East Coast, the Transcontinental Railroad starts in Omaha, Nebraska from the East Coast. And that is going to be laid by the Union Pacific Railroad. And it's going to move westward. It's going to go through, and you can see at the upper left-hand corner, you can see Omaha and then San Francisco. So there's that red line. So that's going to be where the tracks are laid. That's going to be the Transcontinental Railroad. And the Union Pacific, their laborers were former Union soldiers and Irish immigrants. And they're going to lay 1,100 miles to get to the point where they're going to meet the West Coast. And the West Coast Railroad was called the Central Pacific. And it's going to start in Sacramento, not San Francisco. It's going to start in Sacramento. And it was owned by a man by the name of Leland Stanford. And you might recognize that name, Stanford University. That's actually named after his son. But he was the governor of California at this time. And Leland, as the governor, gave his own railroad company the contracts for the state railroads. And then from the federal government, he collected over $20 he got 8 million acres of land, and he collected $27 million from the government to lay his portion of the railroad. Now they're going to meet in Utah. And the reason that they're going to meet in Utah is people coming westward, starting in Omaha, it's a lot more level land, right? They're having to go through Native American lands, but it's level land. But the people that are coming from the west and moving eastward, they have to cross the Sierra Nevada mountain range and do all the blasting. And it's extremely hard, dangerous, strenuous work. So a lot of the men, the white men that lived in California, went there for the gold rush, and they were happy to just keep prospecting. They weren't that interested in this type of manual labor. And so Leland Stanford actually he was very important in having the Chinese railroad workers come over from China. And he imported over 14,000 of these Chinese laborers. Now, what's, a little bit sad is that Leland Stanford then goes out of his way to make sure he supports the Chinese Exclusion Act after that, claiming that the Chinese are an inferior race after they have put this railroad together for him. Now they're going to lay 700 miles. So 700 miles coming from the west, 1,100 miles going from the east. So it's going to be 1,800 miles of track. It's going to take over 6 years to build. It's going to cost the US government over $100 million, but it's worth it because now you can travel across the country in under 2 weeks instead of 6 months through wagon train or however you're going to get there or go around the Panama. So the one thing that's interesting about all these workers is that they had competitions between them to try to make it not so boring, and they would try to outdo each other on the amount of track they could lay per day. And so the Chinese workers actually have the record for laying the most track in one day, and that was 10 miles, which is an amazing, I think, accomplishment based on the fact that they're working the harder terrain.
Absolutely. And once the Transcontinental Railroad is completed, rail construction in the next 20 years is just explosive. Well, you can see from the graph, and this is the same map that we had up on the corner of the last screen, but this is a little clearer where you can see the first transcontinental 1870 date. And then fast forward 20 years during the Gilded Age and look at what the rail system looks like at the United States at that point. The growth was absolutely massive. And because it wasn't just the rails that were growing, all the industries around the rails were growing as well. So you might ask yourself, the folks that headed up these businesses probably got pretty rich, didn't they? Yeah. Nancy, tell us about it.
Okay, I just want to mention the Golden Stake that Leland Stanford actually drives in Utah is at the University of Stanford if you ever go out to the West Coast and you want to see the stake. So we're going to talk about the stories that I promised you, and it's about these men that Kay talked about that become uber wealthy. And so some people call them robber barons, and then some people call them captains of industry. And so the robber baron term is the derogatory term toward these men. And it's not derogatory. It's not derogatory because they became rich. It's derogatory about how they became rich. And so the robber barons are going to become uber wealthy, basically on the backs of the poor, on the workers, right? And then some people call them captains of industry because they did, even though they created their mass wealth by stepping on the little people, they do some good things, right? And most of them, and not all of them, and we'll talk about this, actually become philanthropists. And so they do give back to the community. I just love this graphic here. Can you go back? Okay.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, the graphic here. These are the railroad men on the continent, and they're playing the game of Monopoly. See the dice there, carving up the country by using the railroads.
Right.
So the first group of robber barons, if you will, are the railroad men. And the first one I'm going to talk about is one that's probably the most familiar to all of us, most well-known, and that was Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt. And he was born in the end of the 18th century, and he was born on Staten Island, New York, to a very poor family. His father was a ferry boat man. And when he's a teenager, he says to his mom, hey, if you loan me $100, any of your kids say this to you, hey, if you loan me $100, I'm going to be rich. And so she does give him $100, and he buys his own ferry boat, and he does become rich. And so he's using his ferries, gets enough money to where he's buying steamboats, and he has a large collection of steamboats, and he becomes wealthy, very wealthy, but not uber rich. Where he becomes uber rich is owning these railroads. And he starts buying small railroads, and then he's consolidating them into bigger railroads. And he creates the New York Central Railroad Company, which was one of the largest corporations in the United States at that time. And then he's going to start purchasing stock in other railroads. So a lot of the railroad barons, they get wealthy building the railroads, but they don't get wealthy by continuing to operate them, right? They're going to go through stock and manipulating markets. And by 1900, 7 men control over 70% of all the railroads in the country. And when Vanderbilt dies in 1877, he's accumulated over $100 million. And that places him among the top 3 wealthiest individuals in American history. Now, Mr. Vanderbilt had 13 children, and he leaves 95% of that 100 million to one son, Billy. His name is Billy. And Billy's going to then double that amount of inheritance. But unfortunately, within 50 years, all of the Vanderbilt wealth is going to be gone. And I heard somebody when that came in the room, they were talking about Anderson Cooper, which he, of course, is a Vanderbilt heir. And of course, Anderson Cooper's a millionaire, but his wealth does not come through the Vanderbilt line. This is a picture of the Vanderbilts, and the gentleman that's in the middle there with the bald head, that is Billy. And so Billy's children are going to be the Vanderbilts: Cornelius II, William K., George Washington, who built Biltmore. They're the ones that are going to build these mansions. And so when we talk about the Vanderbilts next month, it's going to be Billy's children primarily that we're going to talk about, because they're alive and well during the Gilded Age. This is Alva Vanderbilt. If you watch the Gilded Age on HBO, this is Alva Vanderbilt's married to Billy's son, William K. And they're the ones that build these mansions in Newport. So it's the Commodore's grandchildren that kind of rule the later part of the Gilded Age.
But Vanderbilt wasn't, as we said, the sole railroad baron. There were several others, and we'd like to point out just a few of them on this screen. On the upper left, Jay Gould, Jim Fisk, Edward Harriman, and Collis P. Huntington, to name a few. And the one that, it could be easily said, as Nancy talked about earlier, that you had so much in the way of government subsidies that many of these men actually got the majority of their wealth from the government subsidies that were given to build and develop the railroads. The government paid over $94 million for the construction of the rail, but the rails, and we're not talking the Transcontinental Railroad that she talked about, but just the expansion that we saw after the Transcontinental, but it only cost $50 million for them to do that. So that's a vast difference. The barons would bribe the congressman in order to get away with the fraud, and they did indeed get away with it. But the one that we're going to concentrate on today is gentleman in the upper left-hand corner, a man by the name of Jay Gould. And referring back to our friend Mark Twain, he was quoted in referring to Gould as saying he was the mightiest disaster that has ever befallen this country. Newspapers would refer to Gould as Mephistopheles, a ghoul in human form. And in one case, it was quoted as saying he was the most sinister figure ever to have flitted bat-like across the vision of the American people. This was not a well-liked man in any way, shape, or form. At one time, Gould had control over every 1 out of 6 miles of railroad track in the United States. Gould also owned a newspaper in New York City, and he would use that newspaper to write disparaging articles about different rail companies that he wanted to buy, driving down the stock price. Then he'd go in, buy the cheap stock, and within months, he would be worth double, triple, or quadruple what he had paid for it. This kind of stock manipulation was his forte. In fact, early on in his career, he took on Cornelius Vanderbilt with a similar stock manipulation tactic. He watered down the stock price of the Erie Railroad by issuing thousands of worthless shares, and he single-handedly caused Vanderbilt to lose $7 million in his investment in that rail line. We're going to show you next a picture of Gould. At the time of his death, his estate was worth what in today's dollars would be approximately $84 billion. But by the time he had 3 sons and a daughter, Helen, by the time their children, his grandchildren, stood in line to inherit, only $5 million was left. So as we mentioned earlier, the rail barons, that we've talked about the rail barons, but we talked also at length about all the industries that, came about because rail was growing at such an expansive rate. So we found this lovely characterization that Nancy and I just love of some of the other robber barons during the era. And these would be the 3 most famous that you would be familiar with. On the far left, that would be Andrew Carnegie, or Carnegie, as it is sometimes pronounced. In the middle, J.P. Morgan. And to your right, John D. Rockefeller. So starting with Carnegie, Nancy, tell us about steel.
Okay, so steel is not an American invention, obviously, but in the 1860s, we were only producing 20,000 tons of steel a year. And by 1900, that number is going to increase to 10 million tons a year. And that's because the process of creating steel originally had to be done by highly skilled artisans, and they worked in small batches. But there was the creation, and again, it's not an American invention, but a European invention of the Bessemer converter, and that made the conversion of iron ore into steel much easier. And so unskilled men could make vast quantities of the steel, and you could make it a lot cheaper. And Carnegie invested heavily in these converters, and he employed them in all of his mills. And so just if you don't know how steel is made, they dig iron ore out of the ground, and they put them at this time in the 1890s, they put them in these huge open hearth steel furnaces. And one of the most famous steel mills had over 16 of these open hearth furnaces. And steel melts at, I think it's 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. So it has So having 16 furnaces here, it could get over 3,000 degrees at one time. And so I found this description of a steel workers, as they call it, a steel workers lot in the 1800s. And they said it was grueling. They would work 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week. They'd get one single holiday off, and you'd think it was Christmas, right? Nope, it was the 4th of July. And then for the rest of the year, they worked every day like draft animals. And the average worker in 1890 received about $10 a week, which was just above the poverty level of $500. And it said it took the wages of nearly 4,000 steel workers to match the earnings of Carnegie. And I also found another quote where Carnegie was making $93,000 per day just in the steel industry. So you want to know, why did the people hate the robber barons so much? You have someone like Andrew Carnegie making $93,000 a day, where his workers are making $1.80 a day. So Carnegie's going to eventually become a better person, but at the early stages of his industry, he cared very little for his workers.
So let's talk a little bit more about Carnegie. Carnegie was born in Scotland and was from a very poor family. He was a Scottish immigrant. He comes over to the United States. And he actually begins working as a clerk at a railroad, and then he just keeps going and going, and he starts researching steel and the mining of iron. And he begins to amass his massive wealth by controlling all aspects of the production of his steel. It was a creative concept at the time. He created the concept of something that's called vertical integration. So what that means is he not only had to buy the iron ore, but the mines that produce the iron ore. He would not only have to buy the equipment for the smelting process, but he would also have to buy the ships and the barges that he shipped it on, and even so much as the retailers that sold his product. So he owned every aspect of the business, top to bottom. The other thing that Carnegie does become, he's not as terrible a man as you might think, because he actually sets the standard for modern philanthropy by writing in 1889 an essay called The Gospel of Wealth. And it's considered even today to be a foundational document in the field of philanthropy. He felt that the wealthy had a moral obligation to give away as much of their money as possible during their lifetime. Now, does that sound familiar? Like the Gates Foundation doing the same thing now? He is famous for the quote of having said, "The man who dies thus rich dies disgraced." So just as an example of some of the things that Carnegie funded during his lifetime and after was over 2,500 libraries in the English-speaking countries, including one very close to where we're standing today over in Eureka Springs, the Carnegie Libraries there. Carnegie also contributed vastly to the Tuskegee Institute, Carnegie Hall, the Carnegie Foundation that supports still very vital and ongoing giving today. So he does set the standard for his associates and the other people that are making big money during that time, in that he does lead them in giving. Here is a picture that we have of Carnegie with his wife and his sole heir, who was his daughter, Margaret. Now, interestingly, he does not marry till he is 51 years old, and he doesn't have his first child until he is 61 years old. And there's a reason for that. Margaret was named after his mother, who was considered to be quite overbearing, and she did not allow her son to marry. So he wasn't allowed to marry until after his death. Now think about that. One of the wealthiest men in the world, and he's kowtowing to his mother still. Just as an example, we kind of want to put into perspective just how rich Carnegie was. At peak, roughly around 309 billion in today's dollars, and compare that to Gates, Walton, Buffett, and Carlos Slim. It is absolutely double and triple those amounts.
Sorry.
So Nancy, tell us about our next type. Sorry.
So John D. Rockefeller is the next robber baron. Now, John D. Rockefeller, he becomes wealthy through oil, and he's the founder of Standard Oil Company. He's America's very first billionaire. And today, 100 years later, he is still the richest American ever, which is staggering. He realized early on, right after the Civil War, that oil is going to be the future of his wealth. And so he buys up every oil company, every refinery, every competitor. And so Kay talks about the vertical monopoly of Carnegie. So Rockefeller employed what is more traditional monopoly. He did a horizontal. He bought up all of his competition. And so at one point, he owns 90% of all the oil in the country. He controlled it. And so after he has this horizontal monopoly, then he turns around and then he starts creating these vertical monopolies where he does the oil production, the refinery, the supplying. And at first, of course, the oil is mainly used for lighting and for machines. But once the automobile is invented, then there's no stopping his wealth. And it's not until later in life that he becomes a philanthropist. Now, he's primarily the person or the reason, if you will, that we have antitrust laws today. And the government took Standard Oil and broke his company into 34 separate entities. Some of them we still recognize today, like Exxon and Chevron. They were all part of Standard Oil at the very beginning. And he even got into iron ore, and was trying to compete with Carnegie. And so I always tell my son, money is not the source of all happiness, right? So even Mr. Rockefeller, whose net worth was worth $1.4 billion when he was alive, apparently had some stressors, because later in life, he develops alopecia. And that's when your hair starts falling out, for those of you that aren't familiar with the disease. Yeah. So here he is, his mustache has fallen off, and all of his hair has fallen off, and he's actually wearing a toupee there. But he doesn't create his foundation until 1906. And the advice he got was to create this foundation, because otherwise that's John D. Rockefeller Jr. standing behind him. Otherwise, his heirs are going to squander it. And so he should give it to the good. So in 1906, he creates the Rockefeller Foundation, which, again, if you watch PBS, you're going to hear at the end, Carnegie Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation. Those foundations are still very active today. And he actually founded the University of Chicago also.
So the next person on our characterization was a gentleman by the name of J.P. Morgan. Now, Morgan built his banking empire by investing in companies and in turn getting a seat on the board of those companies. So he is building what was known at the time as, and still known today, as money trusts. And that meant he and his bank had a controlling decision on who else sat on the boards of all these companies and how the companies operated. Morgan justified what he did by saying that it was really a public service and it brings stability to the economy. But in truth, he wasn't just running his bank. He was running all the separate businesses that they invested in too. And interestingly, ends up buying Carnegie Steel from Andrew Carnegie. So his actions become singularly responsible for the creation of the Federal Trade Commission and the Federal Reserve. Nancy does want me to point out, however, his house in New York City. If you ever get up to New York, it's worth a stop to go see his house, because he was a collector of antiquities, and he has amazing exhibits of Egyptian artifacts and even a copy of the Gutenberg Bible. So here's a picture of J.P. Morgan holding his first grandchild, and this was shot in 1892. At that time, his estimated wealth was $64 billion in today's dollars.
So those robber barons that we just covered are probably the ones that are most familiar to you. You've heard their names. You're probably familiar with some part of their life story. But the ones we're going to talk about now, you may not be familiar with, but they were as equally well known in their day as the other robber barons that we just covered. They were equally hated as the robber barons that we just talked about. And this is one of my favorite. These are the people that actually, these robber barons, they made their money, not through railroads, but through mining our natural resources. And this gentleman is John Graham Fair. And he was what was called of the Silver Kings. And he was one of three Irishmen, Fair, Flood, and O'Brien. That sounds like a great Irish trio, right? Fair, Flood, and O'Brien. And two of them were born in Ireland. One was born here, two Irish immigrants. And so John Graham Fair, he comes over when he's 12 years old. His family settles in Ohio. But in 1849, he hears about the gold rush. And he wants to be a part of it. So he makes his way to California. Now, like any good Irishman, Mr. Fair had a drinking problem. And so he is in the mines. He's a prospector. He brings his family there. His daughter grows up in the mines. And he's fairly successful with gold prospecting. He makes enough money that these three men go into a partnership. And Flood and O'Brien, they open a saloon in San Francisco. But Mr. Fair, he goes to Nevada, to Virginia City, and he starts supervising the mining of silver. And under his supervision, his men strike the largest silver vein that's ever been discovered in this country. And so he and his two partners overnight are multimillionaires. And he is eventually even elected senator. Now, this is before direct population election of senators. He's elected senators by the state Congress. They send him to DC, and he's extremely bored with what goes on in Congress, which we can kind of relate to today. And he wasn't very popular. He's accused of buying his seat, like a lot of the senators of the day. And while he's in these mining villages and drinking, he was known as a womanizer. Now, they claim he's a very handsome man. I'll leave that up to your judgment. This is his picture. And he has a lot of affairs. So his wife is going to divorce him, and she is going to get the largest divorce settlement of anybody up to that date. She gets $5 million in her settlement. And they have two daughters. They have 2 boys and 2 daughters. And the 2 daughters become famous in their own right. Tessie Fair is going to marry a man by the name of Ulrich, Herman Ulrich. He's a shipping magnate. And so Tessie, although she's in San Francisco, she's looking across the country at Newport, Rhode Island. And she wants to conquer society in Newport, Rhode Island. And so she marries Mr. Ulrich. And for her wedding, Mr. Fair, her dad, gives her $1 million. And he's expecting a wedding invitation, which never comes. And so after Tessie marries Herman, she does build a beautiful mansion in Newport. I don't know if anybody's ever been to Rosecliff. Rosecliff is where the first Great Gatsby was filmed. So if you saw the first Great Gatsby, you saw her magnificent, her mansion, which again is open to the public because it's owned by the Preservation Society. And she's going to become, and when we talk about the grand dames in spring of the society, she's going to be one of the women that we're going to talk about, how she joins forces with Alva Vanderbilt and Mamie Fish and dominate the societal scenes in Newport and in New York. Now, she has a younger sister who's named Virginia, who goes by the name of Bertie. Bertie is going to marry Alva Vanderbilt's son, William Vanderbilt. So again, you're going to have these people coming to Newport and becoming active in society. Now, later in life, the 2 daughters establish a hotel chain called the Fairmont. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of the Fairmont. It's uber luxurious chain. There's one in downtown Manhattan. There's one in downtown San Francisco. And that's in honor of their father, John Fair. He was also a railroad builder and a real estate investor. And at one time, he was the largest taxpayer in the city of San Francisco.
So keeping in line with the mining of precious metals, next we turn to copper. And the largest copper deposit in the world at the time was in Montana, right around the area of Butte, Montana. And I recently went up there not too long, a few weeks ago, as a matter of fact, and learned about the importance of copper to Montana and that part of the western states. There were 3 copper kings, as we said, silver kings. They had the silver. There were 3 copper kings, Daly, Hines, and Clark. But I want to concentrate on William Clark because he becomes the very embodiment of Gilded Age excess and corruption. He, like Fair, probably brought his seat in the U.S. Senate by bribing U.S. Montana senators. And it could be stated that both Fair and he were probably the cause of the 17th passage of the 17th Amendment, which switched the election of our senators to the populace as opposed to being nominated and elected by the representatives in each state they served. Twain, we're going back to him again, wrote of our friend Mr. Clark, and said, "He is as rotten a human as can be found anywhere under the flag. He is a shame to the American nation, and no one has helped to send him to the Senate who did not know his proper place was in the penitentiary with a ball and chain on his legs. To my mind, he is the most disgusting creature the Republic has ever produced since Boss Tweed's time." Now, Clark's response to Twain's accusation was basically to say, "I've never bought a man who wasn't willing to be sold." So he had no qualms about his actions. The interesting thing about Clark is he's one of the few that never gave any of his money away in a philanthropic effort. And he does have an heir, a daughter by the name of Huette Clark, who is left his money. And she actually had many mansions that were built that she never stepped foot in, because she ended up living the last 20, 30 years of her life in a hospital setting. So when she dies, she wills all of her wealth to go to the nurses, doctors, and staff who had cared for her for so many years. Well, the other heirs of Clark's estate didn't care for that so much. So they went to battle, and they ended up winning their case and getting the Clark money back into the family, as they claimed undue influence by those folks who were caretakers. And just as a little point of trivia, for those of you that have traveled to Las Vegas, about Clark County in Nevada is named after William Clark.
Just to note that Oulette, who spent the last 30 years of her life in a hospital, not because there was anything medically wrong with her.
Right. I apologize. I should have mentioned.
Yeah, she just
there was nothing wrong with her. She just chose it as her way of life.
Yeah. So then the next natural resource robber baron, if you will, was a coal magnate. His name is Edward J. Berwind, and he was considered to be the world's largest individual owner of coal mining properties. Now, he's from Pennsylvania. That's a little unusual. And he and his brother owned these coal mines. And then when his brother dies, Edwin becomes the sole owner. And he also, he had mansions many places. And this picture on the lower right is a picture of the Elms, which is a mansion in Newport, Rhode Island. It's one of the largest, most beautiful mansions in Rhode Island, in Newport. And he was a very difficult employer. He cut his coal mine workers' salary by 32 to 54%. And then when they had the nerve to object and go on strike, he then gave them 5 days to vacate the homes. And that's significant because he would go in, of course, coal is mined in these rural areas, West Virginia, Kentucky, and he would go in and he would create these mining towns, and he would name the towns after himself. He would either call like Berwind or Windbur. He'd come up with these names, and he would create like a company town, a company store. He would build the houses for management, and of course, he built those out of brick. And then he would build houses for the miners and their family, but he felt that frame houses were good enough for them. And so when they go on strike and he tells them they have to get out of their houses, they have nowhere to go because they have no money. And they end up living in tents around the coal mines until they can leave the area and try to get employed somewhere else. And he carries this philosophy of not bargaining with people into his private life. And he refused to negotiate with his employees and his staff. And in 1902 at the Elms, his staff, they were expected to work 7 days a week for the whole 10 to 12 summer season. And his philosophy was, well, he pays them well. It's only for 10 to 12 weeks a year. What are they complaining about? And so they didn't want more money. They just wanted 1 day off a week. And when they asked for it, he also fired all of them. So when Kay and I do our domestic servants, our domestics presentation in November, the Elms is going to also be mentioned in that, because we'll give you more detail about how he treated his employees at the Elms. I just threw this in here for a little bit of, I thought it was interesting. You know, we talk about the small coal miner towns that popped up. And this town of Bramwell, West Virginia, was famous in its day because it had the largest number of millionaires per capita. So a town of 4,000 people, in its peak, it had 14 millionaires. Now, a millionaire sounds like a lot of money. It was a lot of money in the 1880s, but millionaires were looked down upon by the robber barons because, oh, you're just a millionaire, right? And then after this period of time, the people left Bramwell, and today the population of Bramwell, well, from 2020 is less than 300 people.
So just to summarize, if you were to take the top 6 richest people during the Gilded Age, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, and we have thrown Ford in here too, because he does come in at the end of the Gilded Age, Astor and Morgan, their combined wealth in today's dollars would be over 1.4 trillion. Yet in 1890, 11 out of the 12 million families in the United States earned less than $1,200 annually, with an average income of $380 per year. So that puts the disparity in very clear terms. So you might ask yourself, are we living in another Gilded Age? Let's look. The top 6 people in the United States today, and by people we're using the Walton family as one, but the Walton family, Elon Musk, the richest individual in the United States now, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Larry Ellison, and Larry Page, only equal 927 billion. And if you look at the average family income of 63,214, 14.4% of Americans today are living under the poverty level, which is $30,000 for a family of 4. So Nancy, you know, I was thinking the other day, what would be the reason why some of these guys don't have more money? Like Bezos, Gates, Ellison. And you know what? I think it's because their first wives divorced them and got a heck of a lot of that money, right? So now that's lowered their wealth. But if you were to combine it back in the days where they were at their peak wealth, it may very well be equal to or exceed what it was during the Gilded Age.
I'm sure those women earned every dollar of that.
Yes, we agree. We think that we think they deserved every. So on whose back was all this money made? We said, give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, and they came in droves. Immigrants, the impact of immigration during the Gilded Age cannot be overstated. You had 11.7 million people coming to the United States, and of that, 90% of them were coming from Europe. And by 1900, at the tail end of the Gilded Age, over 40% of the immigrants were living in major cities drawn by the manufacturing and the industries that we've discussed. So it causes a seismic shift in how the United States is set up. Where did they come from and why? Well, if you look at the chart, and this chart goes all the way to the 2010s, but we're primarily wanting to look at prior to the Gilded Age, around the 1850s. If you look at the pink on the bottom, there are the Chinese immigrants that were coming in to build the railroads that Nancy discussed. Right above that, you see the Canadian immigrants, which Nancy's going to discuss here shortly. And then you see during the Gilded Age, a big influx from Central and Eastern Europe, Italy, Russia, Hungary. So you had all these people come to the United States to work. This immigration flow changed the United States from an agrarian society to an urban one. And it's nothing is more telling than looking at the years between 1860 and 1920 and watching decade by decade the population shift. So you start out in 1860 primarily rural, you get down to let's say 1910 even, you're almost as many people in urban environment than in rural, and by 1920 the balance has been turned. What I find particularly interesting is on the graph on your right, you see that the Midwestern cities, Cincinnati, St. Louis, and Chicago, see huge amounts of growth in comparison to the major population centers on the East Coast that are listed. Because of why? They now got rail service. So people are able to go and get to those places via rail.
Okay, can you go back to that colored slide?
Sure. That one?
Nope, one more.
One more?
Yeah, see, I just want to, we mentioned the Chinese coming over during the
Oh, yes.
to build the railroads, and then you notice there's no Chinese immigration after really should be 1882.
Right.
And that's because that they passed a Chinese Exclusion Act, banning Chinese people from immigrating to this country. And then, of course, it goes
Right.
away and then back in. Yeah.
And it goes away later on. Exactly. Thank you, Nancy.
Uh-huh.
So tell us about a little bit about some of the jobs these immigrants worked.
Okay, so the Gilded Age was not the Industrial Revolution. It's really the second Industrial Revolution. And it's when the factory system takes off, and it's tied to the textile industry. And the textile industry factory system then will spread to others. But just up the road from Newport, Rhode Island is a town called Fall River. Anybody been to Fall River? What do you know about Fall River? Who's famous from Fall River? Took an axe, gave her mother 40 whacks.
When she found what she was dead. Lizzie Borden, right.
So Lizzie Borden is from Fall River, but Fall River during the turn of the century was the largest mill town in the country, had over 120 mills. And they created textile. They're primarily cotton and stamped cotton. So it would be the tablecloths, the pajamas, basically any kind of cotton material. Probably came from Fall River, Massachusetts. Sad to say, of course, all the mills are now just empty buildings in Fall River. But by the 1870s, it was the machines that were knitting the stockings, the shirts, the dresses, and they were doing all of the manufacturing of the clothing. And there's a town here in Rhode Island called Woonsocket that had the wool factories. And of course, the Fall River and Woonsocket were on rivers. And so these mills, working in these mills, it was very unpleasant work because they were hot, it was dangerous, you had these fibers that were flying all around. And so most men, American men, they didn't want to work in these mills. And so in Woonsocket, they went to Canada and brought the French Canadians down, and they worked in the mills. And so now the town is now pronounced Woonsocket. For many years, the official language was French. And then, of course, once the labor unions came in, they didn't need this cheap labor, and it kind of transitioned into American laborers. But the other source of labor was, what's the next slide, Kay? Children, right? They had these children working in these mills because, again, they, instead of going to school, they needed to support the family. And there was no child labor laws at that time. And so they looked to children for their source of labor.
And children were work 12-hour days right alongside the adults. There was no difference in the amount of work that was expected from these children. Okay, we're going to take a quick sidestep. Let's talk about Arkansas. You know, we figure if we're going to talk about the Gilded Age, we need to know what happened here as well. Yes.
We need a quick break. Does anyone need a?
Would anyone like to take a break at this point in time? Janet, okay, thank you. I apologize. It is a little cool. But we want to talk about what did the Gilded Age look like in Arkansas? And as the country went, so went Arkansas. By 1895, we had almost 2,400 miles of railroad track throughout the state. There were over, by the end of the 19th century, we had over 7 million acres of land that was being farmed. So we were still largely agricultural. 57% of that was still devoted to cotton. In the years 1879 to 1889, however, we saw a huge massive increase in timber production in the state. So by 1889, you had almost 1,200 different milling and production companies that were located here. But West Virginia, Kentucky were not the only coal production place in the United States. We had coal in Arkansas too. And by 1990, we were looking at 2 million pounds being produced annually. And that's coming from, of all places, the Clarksville area. So if any of y'all have ever been down there, you can actually tour and see some of the area, some of the previous coal areas. Tourism was huge in Arkansas, and there were hot spots in Arkansas, and I say that no pun intended, because of the springs and our natural resources in the state. So Eureka Springs, Hot Springs, and indeed Siloam Springs as well, all became tourist destinations that were well sought by the rich, by people who had money. The interesting thing too is that we did have banks finally coming to the state, and those were established. And most of them were established along the trade lines that were along the rails. So you had here in Fayetteville, McElroy Bank was established in 1871. And our sister city just north of us, Rogers, was founded in 1881 solely because laying of the Frisco train line in that area. So the rich get rich during the Gilded Age and the poor get poor. And at some point, the inequality became so stark for the other 99.9%, if you will, they had to rise up and start movements for change. So Nancy, I want you to show us a quick comparison so our audience can see for themselves just how stark some of these differences were.
So this is the Breakers. This is the Cornelius Vanderbilt II's home. It's the largest mansion in Newport. It is open for tours, but this is where Mr. Vanderbilt's family lived. The next slide is where Mr. Vanderbilt's workers live. So this is tenements. These are slumlords. This is just to show you the dichotomy between the uber rich and the uber poor. So this is where the two housing differences were. And then the next slide shows you, this is Mr. Vanderbilt's bathroom in the Breakers. You can see it's very luxurious, very large, several ways to bathe. The next slide is where the tenement bathrooms were, and these are the low buildings down there. Obviously they're outhouses. There was no running water. So again, my opinion, a picture is worth 1,000 words. You can see how the Vanderbilts lived, and you can see how their workers lived. And then the impact of laissez-faire, because that was the attitude of the day, which was let things take their own course. We don't need government interfering. And because of that, you had things like this tenements. You didn't have housing codes. You didn't have the restrictions on the number of people that could live in the housing. You didn't have sanitary codes. There was no health care. Again, they used child labor, dangerous conditions, and ethnic and race-based discrimination. It was absolutely legal to discriminate based on ethnic or race. And later on, you're going to see these big signs in the East Coast. They were tired of the Irish immigrants. No Irish need apply, right? That's an example of the ethnic based discrimination.
So a boiling point was reached, and we see, different social, political, religious movements start to arise. And we're going to talk about those individually, first starting with social reform. And again, during the latter part of the Gilded Age, you start seeing a progression to what will become known as the progressive era. An advocacy for government to sit up and do something about what's going on and help the people with their social and economic issues. You also had women who in many cases were working side by side along with the men at the same number of hours in the factories at lesser pay, who had absolutely no voice and weren't really even considered citizens of the United States. And so you see an ushering in of a national women's movement in form of suffrage movement. Muckrakers, journalists were doing amazing. The 60 minutes of the day is the way you put it. They had these muckrakers who were uncovering all these and raising awareness of all these huge, massive corruption, poverty, and the civil rights issues that were going on. And because it was an issue at the time, as people were making money they had more and more saloons to service more and more of the people coming here. There was a concern about the social ills of liquor consumption. So a temperance movement became afoot. The most important stark thing was people who were working, there were many, many strikes that took place during the era. But as Nancy said previously, most lost their jobs and they could not be enforced and they had no power. So there was the growth of the labor movement that got its foothold during the Gilded Age, and the first being the Knights of Labor in the Philadelphia area, which eventually extended to what is now known as the AFL-CIO. Nancy, tell us about what was going on politically.
So the Gilded Age is considered the lowest point in American politics, although, again, I might disagree with that. and say that what we're going through right now definitely challenges it as maybe being equal to the level of a low point in politics. Scandal and corruption was rampant, but voter turnout was high. It was the highest participation of eligible voters in history, even including modern times. No surprise, Republicans supported business and industry, and they pushed this laissez-faire narrative that if you were to regulate business or you were to compensate employees when they got injured by their employer, then there would be no incentive. There'd be a disincentive to have business. So that was the party line. Both parties were corrupt. And then you had people like Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall in New York City. And you might ask, why were the immigrants attracted to Boss Tweed? So the Irish immigrant population were the ones that flocked to Boss Tweed, because here you have these immigrants coming over, living in slums, working for less than living wages, and the government not helping them and giving them any form of release. So Boss Tweed said, hey, but remember the old saying, hey, I'm your friend, vote for me, vote as your friend votes. And so once Boss Tweed got in, he turned around and did provide a lot of the jobs and social services that the government was not providing. Now, he also helped himself, because he stole more than $25 million of taxpayers' money while he was in power, and ended up ending his life in jail. But in the meantime, he was quite popular.
And in bad times, folks will tend to turn to a religion. So some of the more interesting developments in the religious movements of the day were the founding of new religions, which were such as the Christian Scientists, the Seventh-day Adventists, and there was a rise of spiritualism. Many spiritualist groups, both old and new, and many of them had unconventional leaders. Nancy and I spent some time researching one in coordination with a story, the story we recently published, a fellow by the name of J. Murray Spear, who actually built, was trying to, correspond religion with the industrialization and electricity being new and all that. So he built an electric powered Messiah in an attempt to merge the new technologies with the older beliefs. But truthfully, the core issues were the country exploded and grew so fast, so quick, industry grew so quick that religion actually had a hard time keeping up with this new industrialization and these new ideas. On the Protestant side, many of the Protestants were split between fundamentalists and liberals, depending on who accepted Darwin's theory of evolution. You saw a rise of a social gospel or Christian socialism in response to the poor working conditions, which basically said, if you managed your industries as Christ in a Christ-like manner, then these problems would be resolved. Now, the immigration influx also grew to a huge growth in the Catholic Church during that time. And the church did a number of very good things during the Gilded Age in terms of providing services to the poor, education and whatnot. But their leadership, for the most part, just ignored what was going on and just accepted that their followers would follow their guidance. And membership started to wane. In fact, between about 1875 and 1890, the Catholic Church, even with all the immigrants coming in, the Catholic Church was losing membership. So they changed stance officially in 1891 and got more involved. So there, as you can see, from a social perspective, a political perspective, and a religious perspective, all movements were leading away from this mass corruption, disparity, poor working conditions, and the rest. So basically, that's why the Gilded Age ended. In essence, it faded because the economic reforms that came because of these movements in the Progressive era, and then the New Deal years of the first half of the 20th century. Primarily you had now higher taxes, stricter regulation of business and finance, greater government investment in private enterprise or public enterprise. All of these things in combination led to the Gilded Age ending. You could also cite the start of the Spanish-American War, because in wartime, the government gets far more busy in what they do for their Americans. and the assassination of President McKinley and the rise of Teddy Roosevelt. There was also toward the tail end of the Gilded Age an economic depression, which also helped. You know, again, as the conditions got so very bad, that's when movements started bringing people out of it. So, Nancy, tell us some of the fun things about the Gilded Age.
Yeah, so we told you about some of the sad things that happened during the Gilded Age, and we painted a pretty bleak picture of some of the leaders, but there were some important innovations that came out of the Gilded Age or that were developed during the Gilded Age. And the first one, of course, is, you know, our kids' favorite invention, the telephone. It was invented in 1876. And just as a comparison, that is the same year as Custer's last stand. So you could imagine the innovations on the East Coast, and then they're fighting the Native Americans on the West Coast. And then George Eastman, he didn't create the first camera, but he created the first handheld camera that was mass produced and available to anyone that had the money to buy one. That was, and also the Kodak film. And then, of course, Thomas Edison, he lived during this time, and he was the most prolific and well-known inventor of the Gilded Age. And he started with the phonograph, the first machine for recording and playing back sound. And the first thing he recorded was he read Mary Had a Little Lamb. And his most famous improvement on the light bulb, he created the first incandescent light. And it's interesting because several of the robber barons invested in the Edison Electric Company. And one of the reasons that they invested was once this light was developed, guess what? Their workers could now work at night. So it increased their productivity.
And as John D. Rockefeller successfully predicted, oil and gas was going to be driven by the creation and now the creation of the automobile. The first gas-powered internal combustion engine automobile, which was three-wheeled, was invented by Carl Benz in Germany in 1886. But by 1893, during the Gilded Age in America, the Duryea, and I'm going to say that wrong again, Duryea brothers, set up the first American car manufacturing company. But as we all know, it was Henry Ford who, for lack of a better term, pretty much stole other people's ideas and made them better. He actually, just as a point of reference, was worked for the Edison Electric Company when he was building his first automobile engines. He developed the automobile assembly line using the conveyor belt model that was utilized in manufacturing, as Nancy talked about, the mill manufacturing, the same type of principles. He built his first car as a quadricycle, and based on that started his first company. But his first company failed, and then his second company failed, and then he decided to build a race car, and he built it, and he won the race in which he was competing. So once he figured out how to build a better engine based on the race car that he had built, he knew he could combine that with the assembly line manufacturing, and eventually it resulted in his ability to mass produce an automobile.
So I just thought it would be interesting to show you when we talk about I think you have to keep pushing them.
Oh, I'm sorry, dear.
Yeah. These are the homes of the people that we have spoken about today. The one on the upper right, that's Carnegie. The one below, of course, is the Elms again. The one on the upper left was Mr. Flood's home, one of the silver barons. And then these are going to be some of the Vanderbilt homes that we're going to talk about next week. And you can see some of them, the one in the upper right, that is part of a university. There's Marble House. These are the ones on Fifth Avenue. On the bottom left is the Biltmore. If anybody's been to the Biltmore, that's where his Commodore's grandson, George Washington, spent all of his inheritance. And below it's the Breakers. So just to show you that, the depth of the money that the Vanderbilts had, and this is what they've left, the white elephants that they have left to various caretakers. So that's in lieu
of assets.
I'm sorry.
I said in lieu of assets.
Yeah. So that's our presentation for today. We're open to answer any questions, or if you want to stick around and ask questions in private, we're happy to talk to you individually. But we do hope we see you back here in what's the date, Kay? September 20th?
No, the next one is October 20th. It's on a Friday, and that's the one where we're gonna do a much deeper dive into the robber barons and give you more of the secrets and stories that you would come to expect from this series. Do we have any questions? Anybody have any comments or discussion? I know it's a lot of material that we went through very quickly. And it was hard for us even to condense it. But our hope was for you to get a good feel about the Gilded Age being as much, if not more, about change and growth and expansion as it was money. Well, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. How many others have been to the Biltmore? I went as a child. I have not been back in many, many years. And I know those of you that raised your hands that said you've been to Newport, did you tour the breakers while you were there? Yeah. So it's amazing, isn't it?
It's amazing to hear about the people that work there and how they had to change the sheets and clean everything, like every time the family went outside to do something or came back. Like
every time, yeah. Right. So that's, and again, that's something when we talk about the domestics of the working class, that's something we'll also discuss is the inordinate amount of unnecessary work that they were asked to do. Right, Nancy? I remember Nancy wrote a story a couple, 2-3 years ago that appeared in Newport Live where she talks about the servants in the stable servants and the things that they had to do during the course of the day. Yes, sir.
I'm curious if we review, after we visited Newport in 2014, I came across a mystery author named
Alyssa Maxwell, the mystery author in Newport.
Yes,
Nancy, do you know her?
Yes, she writes a lot of, she's with Kensington Press, Kay.
Oh, that's the one. Okay, yes.
They're very good, and they're written in the time frame that the mansions were occupied.
Right.
And every one of her books has one of the mansions, one of the names of the mansions in the title. They're really quite fun.
Yeah.
They're really quite fun. Even for those who are in this class, we enjoy a mystery. They're quite fun. And it's an easy read and it kind of gives you a flavor of.
So they're fictional, but they occur in a factual place. Right. Well, I know Nancy and I have concentrated primarily in our writing on working with, we've done long form nonfiction that tell us where we have to document every single thing we say. But we've also done creative historical nonfiction in that we have taken real characters. One book in particular, which is we have an editor working on right now, is where we have taken a real life circumstance and we have had to sort of create dialogue and scenarios to move it along, but we've stuck as close to the historical facts as possible in it.
And not in the domestic servants, it's not just going to be on the servant's life, but we actually have some lawsuits where the servants sued their employers and they, prevailed or didn't prevail. I won't give away the ending, but so they a lot of them didn't just lay down and take the abuse; they fought back.
Right, they did. Yes, ma'am.
what is the name of your book?
Well, the book that we currently have under consideration is His One Wicked Deed, A Gilded Age Tale of Murder and Madness. And it is the book that we based the article that was published by Smithsonian is the same character, the same situation, 85,000 words condensed to 6,000. So there's a lot that's left out that we hope the book brings in the other stuff that people might be interested in.
I'm very unfamiliar with the Northeast coast, but why Newport?
Why Newport, Nancy? Why Newport? Why was it the place that attracted the wealthy?
So how many of you are watching the Gilded Age on HBO? Anybody watching that?
We have quite a few hands raised.
So that is where, what's the name of the fur person?
Astor.
Yeah, Astor. I had a momentary lapse here. So that's where Miss Astor was to Newport. Why Newport? Newport, it was a shipper or a train ride away. It has moderate temperatures in the summertime. It started out with the Southern planters came to Newport for the summer to get away from the heat and the sickness of the, the mosquitoes. And then, so Charleston, there was a connection between Newport and Charleston, and then the Astors came there. But it's just, you have to come to Newport and you'll understand why it was Newport. It's just, it's a beautiful place.
It's an island. I mean, remember, it's an island. It's surrounded by all sides. And it also was a big military station. Fort Adams was one of the very first military compounds. And the Revolutionary War history of Newport is fascinating, going back prior, you got to remember that, Gilded Age is only 100 years after the creation of the country, right? So, Newport has a long and storied history. Its founding, and I tease Nancy all the time. I didn't realize until we were researching and I was flying, and we were going during COVID, we were driving back and forth between Newport and Arkansas so we could work together and do research. And at one point, we do a lot. We have to go into ancestry quite a bit, or we go into genealogy resources on the internet. I just randomly typed in something and found out that I'm actually a direct descendant of the founder of Rhode Island. Never knew. Here I was, grew up in Arkansas, never knew that. And Nancy has done so much research. She is a tour guide in Newport. She's an attorney by trade and still works, and has a very successful career as an attorney. But she, on the side, because of her love of history and being a historian, she also does tours for the folks that come through Newport.
And then just as an aside, there was, as they say, the story goes, there was a tailor who was from Newport who had very rich customers in New York City. And as these rich customers were getting fitted for their clothing, he would tell them that he had land available in Newport. And so he marketed all the land, what today we call the Cliff Walk, which is on the ocean, above the ocean on a cliff, like the name says, and Bellevue Avenue. And he started selling these lots to these wealthy, now this is 1850s, so it's, pre-Gilded Age. But he started selling these lots to these wealthy New Yorkers. And then once the New Yorkers got there, friends would come and visit, or family would come and visit. And then they started buying homes and, tearing down homes or buying homes. So, it's kind of like the word got out, friends came and bought with friends or families.
And as what often happens in such situations, it's kind of like a spitting contest, who can build the best and the biggest and that's kind of what it became, right, Nancy?
Yeah, I mean, Mr. Vanderbilt that built the breakers, he actually had bought a wooden villa from one of the Lowellard men, and he was going to live there. And it was only 10,000 square feet, but he was going to live there. And he and his family were there, and at Thanksgiving it caught fire and it burned down. And so because of that, he builds the breakers here. It's the largest it's the largest mansion in Newport. It's I can't remember, I think it's 100,000 square feet, but he made it out of, you could see, stone so that it wouldn't burn down. And he also took the mechanicals to the home and put them across the street, buried across the street, so that he was so afraid of fire after that. And then the house in the middle, that's Marble House, that's Alba Vanderbilt's house. She imported all of her marble from Europe because they wanted to build these palaces like the royalty of Europe lived.
Right. And one of the Lorellards, the female heir to the Lorillard was Catherine Lorillard Wolfe, and she built another one of the Gilded Age mansions 2 doors down from, and one of the Vanderbilts ends up buying her house, but hers was based on Viking imagery, and so her whole house it has like, I think at one time the roof had actually like a peak, like you would see on the front of a Viking ship, and all sorts of the interior with all sorts of things with the Gaelic gods and so forth, and Viking gods. So very interesting. And then which Vanderbilt bought that one, Nancy?
Well, that was a daughter. That was Florence Trombley. She was a sister.
Oh, Trombley. I'm sorry, Vinland.
Yeah. She was a sister of Cornelius, and so she was a granddaughter of the Commodores. Their houses are all in a row. The one that's kind of behind there was a man by the name of Freddie Vanderbilt, he built that beautiful house that Doris Duke is eventually going to buy. He didn't like Newport, so he moved to Westchester County, New York, and built a huge mansion up there. But the sisters and the brothers, and then their children, they built houses in Newport. So there's no shortage of Vanderbilt real estate in Newport. But none of it is in the Vanderbilt hands today.
Right.
In
Any
fact, the breakers, that is Cooper Anderson's Vanderbilt line. They built that house. Anderson Cooper.
He doesn't even look at it.
About the Astors, right, right. Mhm.
The
Well, very
Astors have a mansion in New York, in Newport, that was recently purchased by Larry Ellison, and he restored it. But it's not open to the public.
One of our wealthiest six that we talked about earlier. Thank you guys so much. We appreciate it, and we appreciate your attendance. We hope you come back to see us again.
Thank you, Nancy and Kay. We appreciate it very much. And I hope you enjoy our new facility. We'll be having quite a few of the class. Now you know how to get here, and hopefully you'll know how to get out.
Nancy, I'll see you later.